Hello everyone! Today, we'll be discussing the 10 most interesting bike trails in the Northeastern United States. There are so many dedicated bike paths all around, and I know all of you have your favorites, so let's quickly go over the criteria for this list. First, it must be at least 5 miles long. Second, it could be of any surface material, although the harder it is to ride, the less people will enjoy it naturally. Third, it generally must lead somewhere interesting. I'm not interested in trails that are just there for the sake of it. And finally, and most importantly, it must have interesting sights and sounds along the way. For instance, I know a lot of you will have your favorite rail trails or canal trails where you can easily go long distances, but I know you'll agree that many of them are completely uninteresting, or go through flat woods or suburbia. I apologize to fans of the Cape Cod Rail Trail and others like it, but they will not be on this list. For these 10 trails, I'm sure you will remember them for a very long time after checking them out for yourselves. So let's get right to it and start with number 10. Up first, we head to Boston, to one of its biggest natural features, the Charles River. There are trails on both sides of the river, and part of it is known as the Dr. Paul Dudley White Bike Path, and the part west of Watertown is just the Charles River Greenway. For the eastern portion, the trail is mostly on both sides of the river, but in total, it goes through Boston, Cambridge, Newton, Watertown, and Waltham. But the most exciting part, and most crowded part, is where the Charles River widens out by the Back Bay and Fenway-Kenmore neighborhoods of Boston, across from the MIT campus in Cambridge. You'll be basking in the skylines of Boston and Cambridge, and seeing tons of bridges and boats along the way, and it's a great way to enjoy the outdoors in the Boston area. At the western end, the trail gets a little rougher on the way to Waltham, and the connection to the far western end at Newton's Norumbega Park is a little confusing, but it's a fine adventure nonetheless. There are also tons of connections to other trails all throughout, so this could be a fine gateway to further adventure in eastern Massachusetts. Up next, we head to Rhode Island for the only time to talk about their nice waterfront trail, the East Bay Bike Path. It's about 14 miles long and runs from East Providence to Bristol. At the East Providence end, the trail starts right across the Seekonk River from India Point Park in Providence, so you can easily begin or end your ride exploring Providence or connecting up with other trails. Once you're on the trail, you're getting views of the city and seeing the industry and cityscape right around the Providence Harbor. Then you pass some coves, lighthouses, state parks, and small bridges until you get to the southern end. At the southern end is a wonderful small town of Bristol, with all its waterfront scenery on the bays, its charming downtown, and it being the home to Roger Williams University. And just to the north is the less charming, but existent, town of Warren, which is a nice stop along the way as well. From the southern end, you can also continue to venture onto Aquidneck Island towards Newport, if you're comfortable riding over the narrow Mount Hope Bridge. This is a lovely trail to traverse, especially in the summer months. Now, there is another major bike trail in Rhode Island, that being the Washington Secondary Rail Trail, but it's just completely through the western Providence suburbs, and not even close to as interesting. You might not have heard of this next one, but it needs and deserves the shout-out. The Keuka Lake Outlet Trail. This is the shortest one on this list, at less than 7 miles long, as it just goes from Finger Lake to Finger Lake in upstate New York. To be more specific, this follows the outlet river of Keuka Lake, the notorious Y-shaped lake, which is also the only Finger Lake whose outflow goes directly to another Finger Lake, that being the largest one, Seneca Lake. The trail starts in Penn Yan, at the sports fields by a cove, and it runs through Penn Yan's downtown, but below street level. It then goes east, downhill, unpaved, all the way to the village of Dresden, midway up Seneca Lake. Dresden is not an exciting village whatsoever, but it's nice making it to the other lake. But along the way, it's way more interesting than you'd expect. You pass through several terrain changes, several waterfalls, old mills, and it almost feels like you're going through a ghost town at the Cascade Mills. If you want more riding at the Dresden end, you can easily continue north to Geneva or south to Watkins Glen. But of all the exciting things to see and do in the Finger Lakes, this feels way more remote and in the middle of nowhere, but with a geographic and historical significance. So I definitely recommend you ride this trail if you're in the area. This next one might be controversial, but here it is. The Old Croton Aqueduct. It's an unpaved trail with a few discontinuities, mostly in the northern New York City suburbs. It runs from the town of Cortland, just northeast of the village of Croton-on-Hudson, and goes nearly 25 miles south to the New York City line, where it effectively continues another 5 miles to the famous High Bridge into Manhattan at High Bridge Park. The trail starts at the New Croton Dam at Croton Gorge County Park and runs south along the Croton River before traversing the woods and crossing into the hearts of some of the classic lower Hudson Valley river towns like Ossining, Sleepy Hollow, Tarrytown, Irvington, Dobbs Ferry, and Hastings-on-Hudson. You have views of the Hudson River at several points, and you cross right into main streets and historic sites like Untermeyer Park in Yonkers. The trail gets a little rough in Yonkers as it bends inland, and then the Bronx portion is very urban and littered in spots. And overall, there are a few annoying impassable areas and detours, like in the area north of Ossining Village and on Yonkers Avenue in Yonkers. But overall, as long as you bring your mountain bike, it's a very exciting adventure. Up next is the Delaware and Lehigh Trail in eastern Pennsylvania. This is a long one, at 165 miles, although it does feel like these are two separate trails, and I've only ever done this in segments. I say this because the southern half of the trail primarily follows the Delaware River, starting in Bristol, working east towards Morrisville, which is across from Trenton, New Jersey, and then it heads straight north upriver towards Easton. But all of it is right alongside State Route 32, and most cyclists who want to go fast will just take the road anyway, since the trail is unpaved, and the road and trail go back and forth as to which one's closer to the river. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an absolutely amazing part of the Delaware River to bike alongside, so it's still a great time. Anyway, once the trail reaches Easton, it leaves the Delaware River to follow, you guessed it, the Lehigh River. Now, this portion mostly runs below street level, right on the river and adjacent canal, as it works its way to the larger cities of Bethlehem and Allentown, which are also great places to explore if you get off the trail. Then, the river and trail bend north, where it heads to the more quaint small towns of Lehighton and the famous Jim Thorpe, where many cyclists actually take the adjacent scenic railway about 25 miles north to Whitehaven and then ride downhill back to Jim Thorpe. There are just so many interesting spots and sights and sounds along the way at every segment of the trail. Now, they're still working on this trail and trying to fill in the gaps, as well as continuing it north towards the Wilkes-Barre area. So, I look forward to seeing what this trail looks like in a few years. We head far away to the east, to Provincetown, Massachusetts, the town at the far end of Cape Cod. Other than the fact that it's one of the most interesting towns you can go to in the US, period, it's also situated on the Cape Cod National Seashore, and there's an incredible bike trail in this part of town called the Province Lands Bike Trail. And I've got to say, this trail feels like a roller coaster. There are all kinds of twists and turns through the beaches, the dunes, the beech forest, the ponds, the cranberry bogs, and the three roads. It's centered on a 5.5-mile loop, but then has spurs to Herring Cove Beach, Race Point Beach, and the Bennett Pond. Just be careful, because sand and water can get on the trail, and I wouldn't recommend riding here in bad weather. The trails only total a little over 7 miles, but it's an incredible experience, and a great part of a long, adventurous day in Provincetown, so definitely bring your bike if you're heading here. The Island Line Trail is the best bike trail along Lake Champlain. It's primarily in Burlington, Vermont, and it runs north from Oakledge Park at the southern end of the city, right into the downtown waterfront, and then north through the beaches and lakefront of the city, over the Winooski River, and into the northern suburbs. But then, in perhaps the climax, it goes straight into Lake Champlain as a causeway for nearly 3 miles. It's absolutely unbelievable, and it feels like you're riding on water. But then, unfortunately, the causeway hits a dead end near the northern end, as they left an opening for boat traffic and never made a swing bridge. There is a seasonal bike ferry at this gap, but there isn't much anyway on the north side. The trail continues into South Hero on Grand Island, but terminates after less than a mile, with nothing to explore. But the causeway is second to none, and the portions in Burlington itself are absolutely incredible and picturesque, especially at sunset. And again, you're in a wonderful city with tons of places to explore, so you'll definitely have a good time. We head back to Pennsylvania to the Schuylkill River Trail. It follows the river almost all the way from the Pottsville area in the coal region, down the Schuylkill River, all the way to Philadelphia. Now, many parts of the trail are still not completed yet, but there are many segments worth doing. I look forward to the Pottsville section being completed, since I'd say that's an underrated city and region to explore. Then, there's the segment between the Philadelphia suburb of Pottstown and the classic city of Reading. Some of this section is unpaved though, and many people don't care for Reading, but it's still worth exploring and seeing a significant part of Pennsylvania culture. Then, from the Phoenixville area, the final 30 miles into Philadelphia are mostly continuous, and of course, the part in Philadelphia itself is the most popular part. The trail cuts into the city via the Manayunk neighborhood, which is an interesting former borough that is dramatically different from the rest of the city, in a cramped valley in the city's northwest corner. Then, it passes Philadelphia's large riverfront parks, Boathouse Row, the Art Museum, and then right into Center City's riverfront, where it continues as a boardwalk over the river until it terminates at South Street. It's a lively and exciting spot to ride through, and you're right in the heart of town at the end. While the Delaware River is the largest river in Philadelphia, the Schuylkill is more in the heart of town, and you'll see more people out and about here than at the Delaware River waterfront. The trail will eventually continue to Fort Mifflin, near the mouth of the river, but this is an incredible trail as it is, right now, that you should definitely check out. Speaking of interesting urban bike trails, there's an incredible bike trail that runs along the entire western shore of Manhattan Island. It's effectively uninterrupted and right on the Hudson River the entire time, and at almost all times, you're completely surrounded by the cityscapes and skylines of various neighborhoods of Manhattan and places in New Jersey like Fort Lee, Hoboken, and Jersey City. However, you don't have to deal with all the cars and traffic and busy avenues of Manhattan. Yeah, the only thing that'll get in your way is the many people who also use this trail and the parks connected to it, because it's such a wonderful place to be. Okay, so at the northern end is Inwood Hill Park, at the northern tip of Manhattan, where you can connect to the Henry Hudson Bridge into the Bronx. The trail technically starts at Dyckman Street, but I warn you now, do not take the waterfront trail here. It dead ends after a mile, as they still haven't gotten the rights to build all the way to the George Washington Bridge. So, you will start by going along the elevated trail next to the Henry Hudson Parkway, until you wind down to the Jeffries Hook Lighthouse under the George Washington Bridge. The next mile and a half is my favorite part, as it's just an amazing collection of parklets, picnic areas, small sports fields, and beautiful views. The trail then cuts behind Riverbank State Park, and then follows the river and narrows up, as parts of it go over the water itself. Once it reaches 59th Street, though, it starts going alongside the many piers of Lower Manhattan, and you usually have to walk your bike if you wish to enter the piers or waterfront parks. The trail gets way more crowded as you get further and further south, and once you get south of Canal Street, you can continue along the trail straight to Battery Park, or you can divert west to the Battery Park City Esplanade. Both options will be crowded on nice days, but it's a really exciting area to explore around. And it's also a great finish line, making it all the way to Battery Park. There is a bike path on the east side of the island, but there are many discontinuities, so expect to be frustrated if you go that way. But if you haven't biked around the area before, you've gotta start with the Hudson River Greenway, no doubt about it. Alright, before we discuss the #1 bike trail in the Northeast, let's display 10 honorable mentions. A couple quick points. Love the Gordon's Pond Trail, but it's quite short. The McDade Trail is in the Delaware Water Gap, but the gravel is quite difficult in spots. As for the Erie Canal, I love seeing the towns it goes through, but the path itself is just super boring along the monotonous canal. Also, I enjoy that they extended the Ohio and Erie Trail into downtown Cleveland, but it's still just an honorable mention for now. The others here should not be controversial at all, definitely deserving of top 20. And as you've probably noticed, a lot of the entries on both of these lists have been in Pennsylvania. Well, that's no coincidence. Pennsylvania has tons of great mountains, rivers, and interesting cities all overlapping each other, creating excellent scenery and corridors for bike trails. And guess what? We're mostly staying in Pennsylvania for the final trail on this list, because the #1 bike trail in the Northeast US on this list is the Great Allegheny Passage and Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Towpath. This is the ultimate trail, going all the way from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for a total of 335 miles. The name of the trail changes in Cumberland, Maryland, but it's 100% the same trail, just continuing, just with the eastern part being technically part of a National Historic Park. Now, those of you who have watched this channel before probably know how much I love Pittsburgh and the surrounding region. To put it quickly, the trail starts pretty much right at Point State Park, where Pittsburgh's iconic rivers meet, and you're surrounded on one side by the tall buildings and unbelievable skyline, on one side by the cliffs of Mount Washington, and the other side by the stadiums and open river views. Then you continue by heading over the Fort Pitt Bridge, and then go east up the Monongahela River, where you go by a gigantic sample of the region's iconic bridges, steel mills, railroads, factories, barges, old towns, valleys, and old industrial infrastructure. It's pretty much everything interesting that I can imagine from my childhood, all in one place. But once you get to McKeesport, the trail turns to follow the Youghiogheny River, where you pass interesting small towns like Ohiopyle and medium-sized towns and cities like Connellsville, as well as tons of mountains and attractions like Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Eventually, it works its way to the Maryland cities of Frostburg and Cumberland, which are also super interesting old industrial cities, or at least Cumberland is. Then it follows the Potomac River eastward, officially as the Chesapeake and Ohio Towpath, and it passes through the Paw Paw Tunnel, and then it passes through several more charming small towns like Hancock and Brunswick, and it passes directly across the river from the West Virginia towns of Shepherdstown and Harper's Ferry. Hello! It's just gem after gem on this trail. And then it works the final 50 or so miles along the river to the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. This trail, without any doubt, has absolutely everything I could possibly want in a bike trail, with all the adventure aspects, the sights and sounds, the locations, the endpoints, the overall uniqueness, and the general enjoyability. Except for it being entirely unpaved. So, do make an educated decision when you come here as to what bike to bring, and you will go slightly slower than on pavement, but there aren't really any adjacent roads to this trail almost anywhere along the stretch, so it's certainly unique enough to be worthwhile. I'll admit, I've only done a few segments of this incredible trail, but I'm hoping someday I can find a time to ride this whole trail in one fell swoop. But you should absolutely check it out, even if it's just in segments. And maybe I'll see you there. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this list and have some new places to ride now. Feel free to argue or tell me your favorites in the comments, but don't be too biased for your hometown trails. I do think the 10 I mentioned are the most interesting, but if you can make a compelling case for others, I'd love to hear it. We'll see you next time on Explore the Northeast. Thanks for watching.